Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. And before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, last episode we did the Western Conference tiers where we took all the different Western Conference teams and put them into different groups. Now we're going to do the same thing, but this time for the Eastern Conference, which is a lot trickier, in my opinion, as we were coming up with this one. So I'll start off with my tier one. I have two teams in the Eastern Conference, so I'm going to have the New York Knicks and the Cleveland Cavaliers, right? Those were two teams where the Knicks were in the conference finals last year, right? They lost to the Pacers. And the Cavs had the best record in the Eastern Conference, right? You know, last year they won over 60 games, right? I mean, they were great in the regular season, 64-18 if you want to be specific. For me personally, the Knicks I would be higher on. I just feel like because in the playoffs, it just feels like that there was a level of toughness and resilience that we saw from them that I feel like we haven't really seen as much from the Cavs. They feel a little bit soft at times. Now, in fairness, they've had more injuries, right? Because last year you didn't have Garland, aside from like a couple of games in the second round, and then I think Mobley missed a game, and then the year before, right, a bunch of their guys, including Mitchell, got hurt, right? But just in the playoffs, it just overall I feel usually worse about them when I see them in the playoffs than in the regular season. And with the Knicks, right, it feels like it's been the opposite, and they've improved, right? They added to their bench, right, which was non-existent last year in terms of the Knicks, right? They added Yabusele, they added Clarkson, they added Brogdon. We'll see if they add anybody else. The Cavs made some moves around the margins as well, right? They brought in Lonzo Ball, right? They sent out Isaac Okoro, and they brought in Larry Nance Jr. So they made, they lost out on Ty Jerome. He left. So they made some moves as well. The Knicks just, I feel a little bit higher on. Obviously, they also made the coaching change as well, right? They brought in Mike Brown to replace Tom Thibodeau. So when you look at this Knicks team, I guess the main question for them is what will Mike Brown do as the coach differently from Tibbs? Is he going to be able to maybe give them some more offensive variety? Because it felt like as they got further and further in the playoffs, there's a lot of Brunson ball, not as much pick and roll with him and Towns, and just overall just not as much variety on the offensive end, right? When everybody on that team eats, and I'm not calling out Brunson like he's a selfish player. I just mean that's how they win for the most part, right? Like a lot of how they win is him with the ball in his hands making decisions. But when everybody on that roster eats, it feels like that's when they're at their best. So I'm, for Mike Brown, can he add more to that offense? And the nice part is by having more depth, you have an actual four in Yabusele. You can have some more versatile lineup. So, I'm curious whether or not they start Mitchell Robinson because he's been now clearly a very important guy, or does he still come off the bench? So do they go with two bigs, or do they have a more conventional lineup? Pretty excited to see that. And they feel to me like more of a slight favorite ahead of the Cavs. And then the Cavs obviously going into this season have some injury issues, right? Because Garland's going to be out to begin the season. Strus is going to be out to begin the season as well. And last year, right, they won 64 games, but their top four guys all played 70 or more games, right? So if that doesn't happen again, right, they're probably not going to win 64 games this year. But they could still win a lot of games because the East should be overall weaker. But, for the Cavs, it just felt like offensively, a lot of what we saw in the regular season, it just felt like, aside from the Heat series, which kind of now gets swept under the rug because of the second round loss to the Pacers. But aside from that, it just felt like the offense wasn't quite as consistent. And then defensively, they were kind of getting lit up. Rebounding wasn't quite there. So I'm just the main thing for the Cavs, if you want to continue to believe in their progression, is the young guys, right? So Evan Mobley, he's still a young guy. Can he get better and continue to progress, especially on the offensive end? And there's no reason to feel like he shouldn't. He's only 24. So I think the Cavs will still be good, as will the Knicks. I'm just higher on the Knicks, but they're both in tier one for me.
Yeah, I agree. Those are the same teams that I have in tier one as well. Pretty much the same reasoning, right? Like with the Knicks, we know where they got last year, up to the conference finals. But Them making the adjustments that they made in the offseason and having the offseason that they did. I think they made great moves along the margin, and especially bolstering their bench depth. So in a weak Eastern Conference where the Celtics aren't going to be at the top of the East, and the Bucks obviously won't necessarily be a crazy threat as they have in years past. I think the Knicks can easily, get the number one seed potentially, alongside Cleveland as well. And Cleveland's the other team. They're a team I think we've always been pretty high on since we started the podcast. It's just they haven't had necessarily the best playoff success,
Right.
due to the injury and some other roster things. But over time, I think they have gradually, gotten better. It just really sucks that a very, very good regular season team kind of just got, I guess, kind of forgotten about in the playoffs because they stunk it up so bad. But we do have to acknowledge that this team is really good. They were injured really, really badly, towards the end of the season, and that definitely did bite them in the butt. But I think they're going to be a very good regular season team this year. So I give them a tier 1 for sure.
They still have a lot of depth, which they didn't have when they first put that group together.
Yeah.
And your young guys should continue to progress and get better. It's just you're probably going to have to probably deal with a few more injuries to your main guys than you did last year. Because like I said with Garland, all of the top 4 guys played at least 70 games. Jared Allen actually played every single game. He played all 82.
Yeah.
Mobley played 71. Garland played 75, and Mitchell played 71.
Mm-hmm.
So and then Ty Jerome was the backup guy off the bench. He played 70. So they had a lot of guys. I think they had 6 players on the roster play 70 or more games last year.
Yeah.
So, moving on, we're going to tier 2, and I have 3 teams in here. This is probably where it's going to start falling apart in terms of like there's going to be differences. I have the Magic, I have the Hawks, and I have the Bucks. So we'll start with the Magic. They obviously made the big move for Desmond Bane, right? They swapped out KCP and Cole Anthony, right? So Desmond Bane offensively should be a huge boost for them. He's another guy that can get you basically 25 and 5 a game while shooting really well from 3, right? As I mentioned with the 5 assists, he's improved as a playmaker, still a solid, a positive defender, even with, the negative wingspan. Strong guy. So I think offensively, just the nice thing now is that should probably trim some of the fat from Paolo's offensive game where, we've talked about it where we're huge fans of his and we think he's a superstar, right? So we believe in him. I know that there are a lot of people who don't like, the shot selection or the efficiency or whatever, but this is why, getting a guy like a Desmond Bane can help because then that means that should give Paolo even more opportunities, to get some really quality looks. And, certainly he can move the ball. He averages 5 assists a game. So he can potentially get even more having another consistent offensive guy like Desmond Bane out there. So they've basically made moves to improve the offense. They also brought in Tyus Jones as a backup. He's not going to be a starter. So that's a good thing, as we've talked about multiple times. So I like what they did. The main thing with them is they're still relatively young and inexperienced, right? They've been to the playoffs the last couple of seasons. You got Franz Wagner, right, who played in the Eurobasket, but we still need to see his 3-point shot, right? Can that continue to improve? Offensively, if they click, right, then we know defensively they've been one of the best teams in the league. So the offensive execution and improvements is kind of what you're looking for. And if that happens, then they should be in tier 2. I wouldn't pick them to make the finals. Again, tier 2 is a little bit different from tier 1, especially compared to the Western Conference, but they should be really good. Like they should be a team where like now they should get out of the first round. And, if they don't, that would be kind of a disappointment. I feel like unless they're like, an 8 seed or something like that. Then the Hawks, they made improvements as well, right? They brought in Porzingis. They brought in Nickeil Alexander-Walker, brought in Luke Kennard. So that's a team where now you've added more shooting, right, to a group of guys where their best 5 guys last year, that's not a great shooting combination. So now you can play different lineups. You also have other young guys, Jalen Johnson, Dyson Daniels, Risa Shea, right? All those guys are young and should continue to improve, right? Dyson Daniels, one most improved, right? Terror on the defensive end. They've now got an identity of long athletes, right, who can defend, and you put those guys around Trae Young. Now, he hasn't had an extension, so does that potentially bleed into what happens this season? We'll see. But, if And the reason why I wouldn't put them in tier one is because they still have questions about, like say Porzingis, can he actually be healthy? Because he's just not been reliable from a games played standpoint in quite some time. The young guys, right? Can they take those leaps that we're looking for, right? Daniels, Jalen Johnson, Risa Shea, can those guys continue to improve? Okongwu, right? What's the battle for the starting center spot? So there's still questions there, but I like the team. And you got Trae Young, who is a polarizing guy, I know, but he's still very good. And now he's at a point where he doesn't have to do every single thing offensively for the Hawks, which is what you want ideally when you're building around a franchise guys. You don't want to have to put your player in the position where he has to do everything or else you don't have a single chance to win, right? And I think the Hawks have done a good job of doing that. And then the Bucks, they're the lowest team in the tier two for me. They have Giannis. So that's already kind of a bonus that some of the teams below them and even the teams above them don't have, right? I would say, right now he'd be the best player in the East. But the problem is the rest of the roster is not very good. And that's where you have the concerns where now Miles Turner's your second best player. Then it's probably Kyle Kuzma. And you just don't really have a lot on the perimeter that you can rely on consistently. And I think regular season wise, like where we could be wrong is they could win more regular season games than we have them penned at as right now. But postseason, I think it'd be very difficult unless you just get a crazy hot shooting performance from some of the guys like Gary Trent Jr. or Kevin Porter Jr., Taurean Prince. It's just a lot of guys where on a really good team, those guys are bench guys, right? Like guys that are at the end of the rotation, not really playing a whole lot unless guys are hurt or in foul trouble, but they have to rely on these guys in order to get them through both the regular season and the playoffs. So I don't know, maybe if Giannis has a monster season and he's healthy and you get some guys to play above their level because he's getting them open looks, okay, but I that would be the team that it would be the least surprising to me if they didn't win a first round matchup, right? Like I said, unless they're a higher seed playing like a lower seed in the first round.
Yeah, we have a similar list for tier two. I have the Magic and Hawks, and I agree with everything you said there, right? Both those teams I think are primed to definitely, take some spots with some teams, being pretty much done for the season and, not being contenders this year because of injuries and whatnot. And shout out to the Magic because I think they had one of the better off seasons, in the past year. We saw them kind of go all in and really commit to building around their two franchise guys. And I think I'm really excited to see, what that team looks like because I think bringing in a guy like Desmond Bane, doesn't necessarily hinder your defense to the point that, like the guys can't guard everybody, right? Like there's still going to be a very strong defense. The problem was offensive consistency. You went out and grabbed a guy like that. I think that automatically puts them in tier two, especially in a conference like this. Pretty similar thing with the Hawks, right? You go out and give, Trae Young a great, lob threat that can be inside out big. That allows you to be super versatile. And I think versatility is something that the Hawks have been lacking in previous years, especially with teams built around Trae Young. Granted, we know that he has some very bad defensive weaknesses, but it's very similar to Orlando, right? Where they have a good defense. You have some really good defenders around Trae Young. And you bring in a guy like Nickeil Alexander-Walker, that's another guy where you can kind of hide and mask, the problems that Trae Young has defensively. So that team, I think, is going to be really, really sneaky underrated for sure. And they're definitely, probably the most underrated team that we've talked about by far. The main difference that our lists do have, I do not have the Bucks here. I have them in a tier below, but I do have the Pistons here instead. This is one of the teams that, I'm super high on in terms of, their young talent and their collective guys, right? Like Cade Cunningham, Jalen Duren. You're going to be getting Jaden Ivey back. Does Ron Holland look, even better in year two? So you have some special guys here, Sora Thompson as well. I think they are going to take a step back in terms of, what they looked like last year, but I think they're still going to be better than the Bucks. If we look at, the records from last year, the Bucks went 48-34 and the Pistons went 44-38. I think I'm higher on the Pistons collectively as a team, more so than the Bucks. I know they have Giannis, but I think there's a lot more talent on the Pistons, in my opinion, than there are on the Bucks. Not super high on that team, as you guys already know. But yeah, I think a 4-game difference pretty much between the two. I expect both those teams to take a step back, but I think the Pistons will be significantly better than that team. So that's kind of my logic there. But overall, I am pretty impressed with what Detroit has put together in the past few years, especially after the playoffs that we saw last year.
Yeah. Tier 3, I have two teams. The Pistons are right there.
Got it.
Like you said, pretty much for the same reasons for the most part, right? They have a lot of upside where you have Cade Cunningham, who's an ascending star, and you have a bunch of young players around him where you feel good about them. You like a lot of them. You just got to see them continue to improve. They've lost some vets, right? And you do kind of wonder, what does that do to the three-point shooting? Because that was kind of a big part of one of the reasons, at least offensively, why they were able to progress. But I think you look at it as, all right, well, Jaden Ivey didn't play the second half of the season, so now you bring him back into the fold, right? You brought in Duncan Robinson. You brought in Karis LeVert, right? So you did add a few vets, right? They're a little bit different than the ones they had. We still don't know what's going to happen with the Malik Beasley situation. But I think they're banking on internal development, right? So as long as Jalen Duren, Asor Thompson, Cade Cunningham, Jaden Ivey, right, Ron Holland, as long as those guys continue to improve, like you said, they could easily move. And we talked about this with the Western Conference, right, where, some of these teams, if things click, could move up a tier, or move down a tier if things don't click. So I could see the Pistons, like you said, easily moving into tier 2 if the young guys all progress really well. And like you said, because they have more collective talent than a team like the Bucks, right? Like they could look better by the end of the season and then maybe go further in the playoffs. But like you said, regular season, they're probably going to finish with relatively similar records. But that's the team that I think could move up. The other team I have in here is Philly, just because I didn't really know where to rank them. Just because when I feel like if this team was actually healthy, if you had healthy Joel Embiid and you had healthy Paul George with all the young guys that they've kind of brought in, right? Like, obviously Maxi's still there, but Jared McCain and VJ Edgecombe, right? We'll see what happens with Quentin Grimes, right? That could be a team that could be a tier 1 team because you have, a guy in Joel Embiid who, when he's fully healthy, is a superstar, and then you have a good supporting cast. But problem is, we don't know if that's going to be the case, right? There's, videos now, going around with Embiid where he looks slimmer, right? But you still have to kind of hold your breath. You don't want to go into the Hawkeye, don't give me hope, type of situation, just because you don't know, right? Like, unfortunately, it's probably less likely that they're going to be healthy and whole than they will be, right? And that's why, like, it's kind of like what we mentioned with Dallas, right? Where it's like, if they were fully healthy going into the season, you can move them up from the tier that we had them in, but they're not, right? We still don't know, for Philly, we still don't know the status with Embiid or Paul George as of right now. So I can't put them in tier 1 because I still have questions about them. And tier 2, I can't put them in because I don't know if they're going to be healthy. So for me, they're in tier 3, but like the Pistons, they could move up if everything clicks for them. But I could move the Sixers up to tier 1 if everything clicks for them. I don't think I could put the Pistons in tier 1 if everything clicks for them.
Yeah. I agree with that generally, right? For me, tier 3, I have the Bucks, 76ers, and Pacers here. For me, I think with the Bucks thing, it's kind of like what you said, but I think I'm just slightly lower on them, right? Like, I think Giannis' talent can only carry them, but so far, I'm going to continue to reference the meme, cover up Giannis and Miles Turner, and that team is complete and utter garbage, right? So that's the problem there for me, and I don't think, they have enough collective talent for me to really put them in the same tier as like a team like the Magic or the Hawks, right? I feel like there's more of an identity there, and with the Bucks, I don't really know what the plan is. They don't necessarily have a clear-cut number 2 option there that I feel comfortable about in the postseason. So that's kind of why I have them.
Giannis, please don't leave.
Exactly. Giannis, please don't leave is the territory we're at. So honestly, if I really wanted to, I could put them in tier 4, but Giannis is the only saving grace there, right? Same thing with the 76ers, right? Kind of similar logic, but I'm definitely higher on the 76ers than I am on the Bucks, right? Because of the collective talent that you just talked about, right? You have Jared McCain, you have Tyrese Maxey, Paul George when healthy, Joel Embiid when healthy. That's a pretty scary sight, in my opinion. You add in a guy like VJ Edgecombe and, all the other additions that they made as well. So, the 76ers, if fully healthy, could be very scary, but we just don't know what Joel Embiid is going to look like, and we definitely don't know if Paul George is even really going to be much of an impact player this season, right? Pacers, similar situation, right? They're not going to have Halliburton, which really sucks, but you do have Siakam, and they are sneaky underrated. Definitely, one of the deeper teams in the league. And I think with a team that deep, not to say that they're not going to miss Halliburton and his impact, but it's more so it's not going to hurt them as much as I think people are really thinking about, right? I know it sounds like I'm saying that it's overblown because it's really not, but I think that's just how good this team is and how many talented guys they have, right? You still have Siakam, who's going to probably be leading the charge, and you have a guy like TJ McConnell who can replicate that. And I think it's going to put pressure on guys like Nemhard to step up offensively, Matherin as well. So I am curious what the team looks like, but I think they're a tier 3 team regardless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now we're moving on into tier 4. This is where it gets fun, right? I have 4 teams in here. I got Boston, Indiana, Miami, Toronto. Right, this is what I have in tier 4. For the Pacers, right? Like you said, it's kind of just like you don't have Halliburton, you lost Miles Turner, you did bring in other bigs, right? You brought in Jay Huff, you brought back Isaiah Jackson.
Yes.
They brought back James Wiseman, and I believe they brought back Tony Bradley as well, right? So they have 4 other centers to play around with. While Turner he's not coming back, but they have multiple centers to play around with, I guess, to try to find the Miles Turner replacement, right? They can all do different things. Like Jay Huff's a stretch big, Jackson's a roller, Wiseman is a question mark, right? Just because he's not been healthy, we've just not seen him play very much. And then Bradley's just a vet, right? He'd probably be the 3rd or 4th guy in that depth chart. Like you said, outside of Halliburton, right, they still have a bunch of other guys because they have Siakam, they have Nemhard, they have McConnell, they have Matherin, they have Jarvis Walker. So they do have a bunch of depth, which is part of why they were so good last year, especially in the playoffs. And they could still probably be a decent defensive team like they were last year. It's just a matter of, are they going to be able to find ways to, close out games like they were able to last year? That might be tougher without Halliburton. So I could see them kind of blowing games that if he was healthy, they probably would win. And then they may not be able to win them with him, not being there and being able to kind of run the offense. But they could be one of those sneaky teams where, like you said, underrated. I wouldn't put them in the contender sphere now. If Halliburton was healthy, they'd be tier 1.
Oh, yeah,
pretty
absolutely.
much with in the Cavs.
Guaranteed.
At this point. Yeah, because they've proven enough. But without Halliburton, it's just kind of hard to make that case. Boston, right? Their situation is a little bit different. Obviously Tatum is out. Maybe he might come back, but I don't think he should, nor do I think he will. And they've also moved on from all their centers, so they don't really have any other bigs left, right? Like Porzingis is gone, Cornette's gone, presumably Horford's gone whenever he signs with Golden State. Still waiting on that. And then after that, it's just kind of a roster that without Tatum, they did bring in Simons, right? Holiday's gone, so they swapped him out. But just without Tatum, I think it's kind of hard for me to put them in the upper tier of the Eastern Conference, right? Like if it was a healthy Tatum, right, they could be tier 1 just because you have Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, and then whatever else you could put around them. But without Tatum, I just feel like it's going to be very difficult. They could still make the playoffs because it's the Eastern Conference, but I just wouldn't be as high on them at this point anymore. And then for the Heat, right, they brought in Norman Powell, so they got Norman Powell pretty much for nothing. Now, we did hear, unfortunately, not long before we got on, that Tyler Hero is going to probably miss the start of the season because he injured his ankle in an offseason workout, so he's probably going to miss the first chunk of the season. But you did bring in Norman Powell, who can give you some offensive firepower. And like I said, they gave up nothing in order to get him. So that could help juice their offense. Still have Bam. Kel'el Ware, right? What does he look like in year 2? Does he progress at all? What is some of the other guys like Kasparis, right? What does he look like as a rookie? So they have a number of pieces, but I still feel like it's going to be difficult for them to get into that upper tier because they just don't have enough talent, in my opinion, right? Especially at the high end where it's like, Bam and Hero are your 2 best players. It just doesn't compare to some of the other groups that are ahead of them. And we also don't know, there's been so much talk about Wiggins or, what if the team kind of falls apart earlier in the season and then maybe by the deadline they start selling off from some guys. They have a number of players that I like, but just as a whole, it's hard to feel great about the Heat team going into the season. And then the Raptors, right? This is the team where this is the only team on the list, right, where they were, a bottom feeder team pretty much last year, and they're moving up a tier, right? Because now you're going to see what it looks like with Scotty Barnes, with Brandon Ingram, with RJ Barrett, with Emmanuel Quickly and Jakob Pertl. If they're healthy and they figure out how to share the ball, they could be a playoff team, play-in playoff team. But you do have to worry about some of these guys not being able to stay healthy, and whether or not they actually will be able to figure out how to play together. So, they could be a team that pops because at the very least, we just haven't seen these five guys play together because Ingram hasn't played for Toronto at all, right? He came to the team injured and didn't play. So they could be a team that maybe could move up a tier, but, tier 3 at best or top of tier 4 at best. But like I said, none of these teams I would expect to contend for the championship this year, right? The Celtics and Pacers, when they get Tatum and Halliburton back, you can move them back up into the upper tiers after this season, but not this year. And then the Heat, I don't think probably will be able to get there anyways, unless they bring in some star within the next couple of seasons. And then the Raptors feel like they're probably just going to be in that middle of the pack.
Yeah. We do have some very big differences here. I have the Celtics, Heat, Bulls, Raptors, and Hornets here in tier 4. I pretty much agree with you in terms of the Celtics, the Heat, and the Raptors. Right? I think the Raptors one is super, super intriguing. I think that's one of the teams where I am kind of circling a couple of their games, where it's like, oh, this could really have some potential to be a, somewhat decent team. Do I think, they're a contender? No, that's why they're in tier 4, but I don't think they're necessarily going to be horrible, right? And they do have tons of potential to move up a tier, and I think they're probably the only team here that can potentially move up a tier. The Hornets, I know that one might, rub some people the wrong way, but I feel like when fully healthy, they could potentially be a really, really good team because we already know what, LaMelo Ball is. I think we need to figure out what Brandon Miller can be at his pinnacle. And this is going to be, I think, a very big year for him, considering that the sample size has been somewhat small, but when he has been on the floor, it's been very impactful. The rookies that they drafted, I think we're looking at those guys trying to figure out, what they can be and, how they fit alongside these guys. The only problem is they don't necessarily have a center, and I know that's probably going to translate to a decent amount of losses in the win column, but at the same time, I am high on their collective talent over there. So, overall, I think they're young. They're going to be an offensive heavy team, and I think that puts them in tier 4. I think they're going to be better than a few of the tier 5 teams that we'll probably both mention. And then the Bulls, I know that was another difference that I think we had. I know a lot of people would probably put them in tier 5 as well, but I am high on Kobe White. I am high on Mataz. I like Josh Giddey as well. So I think they're kind of in a similar territory as the Hornets, right, where I feel like collectively the young talent is definitely there, and I think there is a vision for it. It's just really going to be internal development, and I am higher on their internal development than some of the teams below.
Yeah, like that's a good point where some of these teams, like, and this is where when I get into tier 5, right, it's kind of like, say, so for tier 5 I have Hornets, Wizards, Nets, Bulls, where it's like, for me, it's just hard for me to put those teams in the same tier as like Heat, Celtics, Pacers.
Sure.
But, with the Hornets, with a team like the Hornets and the Bulls, the Hornets, when they're fully healthy, they have upside, right? Because they have LaMelo Ball, right? Who of those 4 teams, probably the best player. They have Brandon Miller, right? Where he's been really good so far his first 2 years in the league. And like you said, we liked what they did in the draft. It's just the problem for them is they just have not been able to stay healthy. They've been cursed pretty much, right? So they're a team where we don't really do this, I feel like, as much with tier 5s, but they're a team where they could definitely move up, right, into tier 4, right, if they're actually healthy and everything clicks for them, because, they do have a little bit more of a foundation in place, right? The Bulls, maybe, I mean, they've been kind of like just an average team, mediocre team in the East for a while now, and it feels like they're probably going to stay there. But it's a matter of how much do you buy into that March stretch, right? Where they were really good to close out the season. Is it real? Is it not? Is it somewhere in the middle? Probably somewhere in the middle. Do their young guys progress and get better? Like you said, Matas, we like. Kobe White's really good. He's in a contract year. So I just feel like they're just probably just going to kind of be in a similar spot as last season where they'll compete for, that bottom of the play-in spot, but probably still won't make the playoffs. And then you have the Wizards and Nets, right, where those are rebuilding teams, right? Like, with the Wizards, right, they have a bunch of young guys, right? They just drafted another one to add to the collection. So, and a lot of those young guys do have upside, but, because they're rebuilding, they're probably not going to be, you probably wouldn't expect them to compete for the play-in this year, right? Like, I think they'll be better, but, they're not going to be challenging for, the 9-10 spot. But for the Nets, right, they're probably going to be worse, right? Because now they don't really have a whole lot of great players. I mean, a bunch of the guys on the roster, they basically added through the draft, right? And it's a lot of guys that are projects, but they want to be bad, right? Like now they got their picks back. So they're not really in that situation now where, oh, we're kind of in a spot where we have to be really good, right? Or else we're just going to kind of be in the spot where we're not going to have our picks and then we're just going to be bad, right? And that's not what you want. So for me, that's where those teams are. But it's not a bad thing. Like, for like when we talk about the tiers, the difference with the East and the Western conferences in the West going into the season, pretty much every team except for Utah is going to go in there with some type of aspirations, right? Outside of just let's, try to be as bad as we can, right? Like in the Western Conference, only the Jazz are going into the season saying like, yeah, we're going to stink, right? But in the Eastern Conference, and maybe that might not be the case, but in the East, there's more teams where if they're bad, that's okay, right? Like like if you're the Wizards or if you're the Nets, you don't have any questions or concerns about like, are we actually going to be good this year? Right? Like, you're probably not going to be that great. I think the Hornets, right, would like to get into the play-in, right? So, like I said, that's why they could move up. It's just the bottom half of the Eastern Conference to me doesn't factor in quite as much to the playoff picture as it does in the Western Conference. Like, you could literally have in the Western Conference, as we've seen the last few years, right, a team that's in the play-in that, wins one or two playoff rounds because we've seen it, right? Time and time again the last few years in the West. Probably not as likely to happen in the Eastern Conference, although I guess, the Pacers were able to do it. But I guess, in some way, shape, or form, you could say maybe in the East it could be likely, but because, you know, you don't have an Oklahoma City at the top. But at the same time, I don't expect the Knicks or the Cavs to go out in the first round, right? Like that would be a disaster. So we'll see what happens. But the Eastern Conference is a different story than the Western Conference. I mean, I guess the question is can we entertain the idea of, say, could these teams actually win the championship? I guess it's a matter of if OKC comes out of the Western Conference, I think it'd be very difficult for them to do that. Now, if it's not Oklahoma City, I think that, the Knicks or the Cavs could have a chance. But who is it? Right? Like could the Knicks beat Denver? You don't think so?
No. I don't think anybody
Really?
in the East could beat anybody in the West in the NBA Finals. That might be a hot take because, like, say the Rockets get there, nobody in the East is taking the Rockets. I don't think anybody could take the Lakers in a seven-game series. No, not with the way the East is shaping up right now. Not with the way it looks. No. Maybe if some of these teams were fully healthy, like guaranteed, like if the 76ers were fully healthy, guaranteed, they'd dog walk the Lakers for sure. But we already know that's not happening. Celtics, same thing. I think they would dog walk the Lakers too, but no, they're not healthy.
Yeah, I mean, either way, like I'm gonna be picking a West. We haven't done our preseason picks yet. I'm gonna pick a Western Conference team to win the championship. I guess spoiler alert.
Me too.
But it is a question I think worth asking because it's just because we've seen because say like last year, right? The Knicks played pretty well out against some of those teams out, like they played well against Denver, but say like last year the Knicks were really weird because they lost so many games to all the top teams. But then in the playoffs, they got to the conference final, so they had to beat some of the better teams, right? Like they had to take out the Celtics, and they looked like a completely different team than they did in the regular season.
Absolutely.
But then with a team like the Cavs, it was the opposite, right? Where they beat the crap out of everybody in the regular season, and then in the playoffs, they look like a completely different team. So that's where, like I said, if it, like the Knicks, I think I could feel high or good about, but then they have questions too, right? Like I just think in the Eastern Conference, those teams have more questions than the top of the West, right? Because OKC really has no questions. It's just a matter of can they be healthy and can their young guys continue to progress? That's pretty much it,
Yeah.
right? But after that, then there is a gap, and so that's why I just kind of could you entertain the idea of a non-Oklahoma City team coming out of the West and losing? I think it's possible. It's just a matter of which Eastern Conference team is it. But then, how many of the teams in the Eastern Conference could you see coming out of the East? Because it is tricky because we have two teams in tier 1, which isn't the case in the Western Conference. But I think you could see more than those two teams coming out of these just because of things like injuries, right? Which we've always seen. Compared to the Western Conference, where it just kind of feels like, OKC might be inevitable, but if it's not them, probably Denver. So what do you think about the Eastern Conference as a whole?
It's weak.
How does it compare to the West to you?
It's weak. Simple as that. That's the first thing. We already know that it's significantly weaker, right? And I feel like tier 1 in the East is more like tier 2 in the West, right? That's the philosophy that I have, because nobody in the East is matching Oklahoma City, right? Like you said, it'd be more of a fight. I think if you look at the tier 2 teams that we had in the Western Conference compared to the tier 1 teams that we had in the East. So that's kind of my logic, right? I'm bumping everybody down in the East probably like a tier, right?
Right.
That's how I look at it.
Right. Yeah, and that's where I would agree with you, right? Like I would put like Oklahoma City and Denver, I would put pretty much ahead of every Eastern Conference team, right?
Exactly.
For Denver, like they've improved their roster, right? Like if this was last year's Denver Nuggets team, right, mostly unchanged, okay, then I would say like, okay, those teams could beat, that version of the Nuggets. But I think this one would be tougher. And I know now we're talking about the Western Conference teams, which lets you know about the Eastern Conference. But I guess, what teams do you feel like outside of the tier 1 and tier 2 like have a lot of upside? Because like I said, in the Western Conference, we kind of had the conversation of, oh, if all these things click, we could move this team up a tier or move this team down a tier.
I would say 76ers, Raptors, and Hornets. Those are the three teams that I would have pegged to potentially go up, depending on how their season is, right? Like 76ers fully healthy, that's a tier 1 team. I don't care what anybody says. Raptors, if they actually look really good and kind of produce what people are expecting on paper, then I think that's probably a tier 3 team. Along with the Hornets as well, fully healthy, I think they're a tier 3 team if they put it together.
Yeah, I'd pretty much agree with you. I guess the thing is, like for the teams like the Magic and the Hawks, right? Like I don't feel like those would be like you said. I think there's a clear delineation between tier 1 and tier 2 in the Eastern Conference. It's just a matter of does everything click, and then maybe the Knicks or Cavs are a little bit down, a little bit banged up, a little bit worn out, just because they've had some deeper playoff runs. And then maybe those teams can catch them by surprise. But
the Hawks would be the one that would, I think, take people by surprise. That would be my pick to be the spoiler.
And I think, and that'll be interesting too, just because of the fact that with Trae Young, we still don't have the extension going on, so he's kind of almost going into a basically prove it season. And both you and I are high on him, right? We believe he's awesome, right? We, even when the Hawks have kind of struggled, right? We've never really wavered on our opinions of him, as one of the, big time stars in the league. Now he's getting into it with Patrick Beverley, which is interesting. But either way, like I said, it should be fun for sure, right? Like, I mean, I know a lot of people are down on the Eastern Conference. I mean, in fairness, as are we, right? But just as a whole, I still think there's a lot to look forward to and there's a lot to be excited about.
I agree.
Yeah, so let us know your thoughts in the comments about the Eastern Conference and the tiers, and whether or not you agree with us. And we'll talk about the Western Conference stuff momentarily. But just as a quick thing, we did have some more Kawhi stuff that came out, or Clippers content that came out. We had some more come out from Pablo Torre, but the funny one, right, came from ESPN with Baxter Holmes, right, who's kind of one of their premier investigative guys, right? He's covered some other things in the past, and he basically got a bunch of quotes from the Clippers, right, where it seems like whoever he was talking to within the organization is kind of just like, yeah, we're done with Kawhi. We can't wait until this relationship ends. He's never available. He has all these demands and everything else. So, now you kind of have somebody other than Pablo Torre, right, who's kind of adding on to the conversation surrounding this Clippers team. And it's star player, right, as of late. So just, I don't know, kind of a weird situation. And it's gotten to the point now where it feels like something is going to happen, right? Where like you're probably going to have Adam Silver do something where he's going to have to throw the hammer down. Don't know what it'll be, right? Don't have any predictions on what's going to happen. But it feels like something is going to have to occur at this point because it just feels like there's, every time you think that Torre's done, he puts out more stuff, which is good for him, right? It's great for the brand and everything. It's just, it make the Clippers look a lot worse, I think, than they initially kind of seemed.
Yeah, it's wild. I hope a resolution is found very soon because I think the more and more that comes out, the worse and worse it's going to get. So I am curious, what the NBA is going to do as a resolution. But I feel like this isn't the first kind of thing that we've heard about Kawhi in terms of like his camp, like him having demands. So that one doesn't necessarily like strike me as super surprising and stuff. Like we heard stuff about that in San Antonio, right? Like this is going way back, even in Toronto as well. So nothing new there, but. Yeah, just the more payment stuff, it's wild. It continues to pile up.
Yeah, I think it pretty much kind of, cements that like, yeah, probably, not the best in terms of leader, right, for a team, right? Probably, not a guy that you probably would want to have as your franchise player at this point. And the tough part is now, because he can't stay healthy, it makes it less worth it, right? Because they did mention, like, yeah, he's a fantastic player when he's healthy. But, he hasn't been healthy. And to add on top of it, now you have all this other stuff, and we'll see what comes out of it. But at this point, I would be pretty surprised if it's just this, and disappointed if it's a slap on the wrist at this point.
I
just
agree.
because it feels like that there's too much there now. Because I actually remember, and just credit to the Mismatch podcast from the Ringer, but I actually remembered. You had even going back the first year we did the podcast, right? Remember there was a game between the Clippers and the Grizzlies, right? And Chris Vernon of the Ringer pointed it out, right? Where like the first half Kawhi plays, and then in the second half he's just gone, right? Like, and nobody knew what happened, right? They asked the other guys on the team, like Russell Westbrook, about it, and they're like, "We don't know what happened. Like, we didn't know anything, right?" I don't know if you remember talking about that, but
I do. Yeah, I do. It was a wild time.
And that was during that stretch of the season where like we were getting close to the end of the regular season where like every game mattered, and it was going to be very difficult to kind of just be in this position where, okay, you can't give away a game here or a game there because that could, completely tank your standings, right? Because we knew that playoff race was wild. I remember literally every other episode we were like standings update.
Yep.
It got crazy at that point. But yeah, I guess basically, I'm assuming at this point, once his contract's up, they will probably not re-sign him. And it's just a matter of, are they going to be able to bring in somebody else? Are they looking towards the future with Giannis? Are they going to grab Jokic? Are they going to do something else? Who knows, right? But it feels like, based off of those quotes, and I mean, those are quotes from, somebody who has a stake in this. But it does feel like that, yeah, that relationship at some point will probably come to an end, which is wild, right? Like at this point, you kind of have to, that this era for the Clippers is pretty much at this point is a failure, right? Because I mean, I know you're, super high on them, and I'm not saying I'm low on them, but just, I don't expect them to win the championship this year, especially with this hanging over their heads, anyways. And now I think, what was it? What was the stat from Zach Lowe, right? Where I think it was they've had more lawsuits or whatever it was than playoff victories.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Wins,
that's
right?
wild.
Because I think they won the 2 series the first year together. Or no, they won the first round matchup against the Mavs, right? Then they lost to the Nuggets in the second round. So they beat the Mavs 2 years in a row. Then they also beat the Jazz, right? That was the year they went to the conference finals. And then the other playoff series win, which one even was that? I mean,
yeah, it's scary.
Yeah. They've had what? Yeah, I guess they've had 3 playoff series wins at this point because they've mostly been a first round exit, other than
Yep.
a couple seasons.
Not a good
So
stat to hang your hat on.
yeah, so we'll see what happens, but just a quick update on that. So um also we did have, I guess, some more Kaminga stuff. I don't know why we continue to get this, but we just do. And now we've had some so his agent is now doing a media tour, right? Where he's, I guess, batting for his guy and talking about the schism between the team, and that Kaminga wants to get paid. I don't know why he's doing this. I don't feel like I've ever seen a situation like this before. I could be wrong, but it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. And I just kind of want this to be over, whether or not it's, him signing a contract, where it's like a multi-year deal, or whether or not it's the qualifying offer. It's just, I don't know. It's just getting kind of dumb at this point.
Yeah, it is getting to the point that, like, this is overly dramatic, right? And I'm gonna be blunt here. I don't think he's of that caliber to the point where this needs to be done.
Right. And there's been reporting where now they've upped their offer to like a 3-year, 75-ish million deal, which, I mean, that's 25 million a year. So that's honestly pretty solid for him, considering, what Josh Giddey got, right? Like, I think that would be okay. It just, they did mention that if he gets that player option, if the team option turns into a player option, then he would probably sign that. Right. And then I guess presumably he just would be back with the team, and then you kind of figure out what you're going to do. I just don't really see a scenario where he stays long term. I mean, I don't know whether or not he's going to sign the qualifying offer or a new deal, but as we've already said, if it's the qualifying offer, it's a disaster, right? And I would pretty much retroactively give their off-season grade an F, because that would pretty much cap your ability to really do a whole lot, because then he can block any trade. And then on top of that, his salary is so small, unless you add other players to the deal, you're not getting anything back. So, I think, maybe it's a matter of which side bluffs first, which side calls the other's bluff. I would think, if I'm Golden State, I have a lot more to lose than Kaminga, just because, maybe he feels confident he can get that offer in unrestricted free agency. I don't know if he actually will, but, like, if you're Golden State, you have to be able to sign Kaminga to a regular contract so you can trade him and get something back. Otherwise, I mean, you're pretty much done. I mean, I think the window's closed anyways, but it would be super glued shut if he took the qualifying offer.
Yeah, I agree. It's wild, man.
Yeah. So now moving on, we got some things to discuss. So as we usually do at the end of the episodes, right? We did have a poll, right, that we always do, and this was about the Western Conference tier list, right, where we asked the question, do you agree with our tier lists? And 76% of responders said no, they do not agree with our tier list.
Let's go. That's what we wanted. Everybody's opinions are different. I am curious, what people's differences were. I don't know if there were any comments, but yeah, I figured that our tier list would probably rub people the wrong way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we had some comments to also read. So the first one I'll read is from YouTube at insert name 1221, and he asked, "How are the Lakers a contender and the Warriors, but the Grizzlies aren't?"
I mean, for me, I think I responded to this comment, but for me, in my opinion, I think it's more so the fact that the Grizzlies don't necessarily have like a top 10 guy. I think with LeBron, with Steph, those are two guys and Luka as well, right? Those are three guys that, as long as they're on your team, you ultimately have a chance, right? Like with a guy like Ja, I don't know if you have a chance. He's very unproven in terms of playoff success, so we kind of need to see him gain that momentum before I think we crown him as one of those guys.
Right. He's got to be healthy. And I think for the Grizzlies, they've had a couple seasons now where they've been in the playoffs and they've been kind of underwhelming. So, and part of that's just Ja's not been healthy, but that's also a problem where he's just not a guy you can physically rely on. Now, if he can overcome that and a lot of the young guys pop, okay. But I just feel like there's too many questions, even more questions than the Lakers and Warriors have, right? Because we don't have them as tier 1. We have them as a tier 3. So we have questions about them as well. But with the Grizzlies, because there's so many unproven players, we have even more questions about them. So I would need to see those guys pop and stay that way for me to feel better about them. And even then, I don't know.
Yeah, I agree.
And then on IG we had a couple comments. So we had one from, let's see, we had one from Faku Ray, right? So FACU_REYYY, and he asked Mavs. And so I responded to this one, and my response was the Mavs feel like a team that need a trade to balance out the roster on the offensive end, and you need a healthy Kyrie back, and you need him back quickly. And then Cooper Flag can help fill the void, but he's going to need time in order to round out his game. And we went back and forth actually in a positive way, right? Where he mentioned like, yeah, he agreed, and that he thinks they need time, but they do have potential. And he also said, "Thank you for the answer. Like your content, and you guys look like nice ones. Keep going."
Hey, I appreciate that, man. We appreciate that. It's all love. And it's always nice, to talk hoops with people. But I think that is a good conversation because people are very tempted to crown the Mavs as contenders, but I think there's too many unknowns with, the whole Kyrie situation. What does AD look like by the end of the season? Cooper Flag, we already know that's a lot of pressure on a number one pick. Granted, we all know he's going to be great. It's just a matter of, is he going to be playoff great? And I don't know how that's going to look in a Western Conference that's already going to be a bloodbath. So I think I'm not mad at either side, right? I'm more on the side of they're not necessarily a contender yet because I think they need to round out the roster a little bit more. But they're definitely on their way. They're right there. They're literally right there.
Yeah. And then we also got one from Tough Bucket Taj 3, and he said Spurs are tier 2. And I responded to this one and I said the Spurs have a ton of upside, but it's fair to question if all the young pieces surrounding Wemby and Fox click together right away. Tiers 1 and 2 should be teams that there aren't too many questions about. Excited to see Wemby and Fox play a full season together. So that was my response. And that's kind of what we talked about on the podcast, where when I have a bunch of questions about your team, I just don't think it's reasonable to put you in tier 1 or tier 2. And, I guess I think based off of, the comments, it feels like we're probably lower on Dallas and lower on the Spurs than general consensus. And, they could bite us back in the butt, right, if everything clicks for both of those teams. But I think it's still fair to feel like, all right, with the Spurs, they just have a lot of young pieces. We haven't seen these guys play together yet. They don't have a lot of shooting, right? So I'm not just going to automatically assume that they're going to win close to 50 games and be, a playoff team or even like a 7-8 team. They have a lot of upside because of the young guys. And, if all of them click, and of course, Wemby continues to ascend, they could be really, really good and a tough team in the regular season. But, just like the Mavs, like they just have a roster where I don't love the fit with all the players on there. It's just a matter of, there's going to be, like you said, growing pains, and they could move up. Both of those teams could move up a tier than what we already have them as, because I think we have both of them as tier 4. So there's a world where they can move up, but I'm not just going to automatically bank on all of that working out.
Yeah, the West was a tough grade because realistically, right, you probably want to put those teams, very high based on their potential. But I think we do have to live in reality, and I'm going to keep singing that tune of, yeah, we can't, jump the gun on teams like the Spurs for sure because of the growing pains. I just know they're just going to bite them, in the butt way, way too early. So I love Dylan Harper, I love Stephon Castle, I love the pairing of Fox and Wemby, but those young guys are going to have growing pains, playing alongside, Wemby and whatnot. But I think defensively, they're going to be one of the best teams in the league, and that's going to translate to the win column automatically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And we just got some stuff while we were recording from clutch points from Brett Siegel that apparently the Warriors stars that Steph, Draymond, and Jimmy Butler have all advocated for the Warriors to re-sign Kuminga. I don't know if that's, so maybe that means that they'll just re-sign him to a regular contract. I have no idea, but as we've already said, right, it's in Golden State's best interest to sign him to a regular contract. You don't want him to take the qualifying offer. It's a lose-lose for everybody, but it could especially be bad for Golden State because, like I said, you can't get anything back. Of course, for Kuminga, there's the gamble of he may just not get the money. So, I mean, I guess the question is, if you're Kuminga, what would you do? Like,
Yeah.
would you take would you take the qualifying offer and basically just say you can take your offers and shove it, or do you just take the deal that they've given him now and just kind of cede some control over to Golden State, or maybe hold out in the hopes that they give him the player option? Like, what would you even do?
I'd be on the Cam Thomas move, right? I'd just take the qualifying offer, signifying I'm on my way out, and we get to a resolution when we get to it, right? Because at the end of the day, he needs to be signed and he needs to play or play somewhere else. So I think that's the end result.
Mm-hmm. We'll see what happens there. I mean, it's kind of a wild scenario, but just it's a situation that just keeps on getting stranger and stranger and stranger. But we'll be near resolution soon. So that's pretty much it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts on the Eastern Conference tiers, whether or not you agree or disagree. Let us know your thoughts, on the Kuminga situation. Do you want to see a resolution to this too? Because I know I do. And if you want to leave a comment, leave it on our socials at the OBT podcast or on our videos or shorts, right? And we don't have much longer before training camp starts, so we're getting pretty close to. We're gonna finally start getting to see some real basketball once we get to the preseason and then regular season. We're basically a month away. Can't wait. To follow everything on every single streaming device and platform known to man. But think it's going to be a great season. So this is the end of the episode. Thanks for watching. We appreciate all the support. Don't forget to like and subscribe.